Lesson 12. We're going to be in verses 1 through 13 of Mark chapter 6 tonight. I mentioned on Sunday, I think, before the sermon, so if you weren't with us physically, you didn't hear this, I made the statement that we're going to spend as much time in Mark chapter 6 as any chapter in this book. We're actually going to be in this chapter for 4 weeks. And it's really more because of the fact that the way that these different pericopes in this chapter are broken down, that it doesn't lend itself to combining them sometimes. For example, next week, we're really just going to spend the entire time talking about John the Baptist being beheaded and all the ramifications from that. And that's going to give us a chance, I believe, to branch out into the other gospel accounts as well. And then the next week, we're going to be in the feeding of the 5,000 and so forth and so on. So anytime that you're looking at a miracle that's in all 4 gospels, I think that requires a slowdown. So as opposed to going breakneck speed through this chapter the way we've done through some, we're going to be looking at a smaller chunk of verses each week for the next 4 weeks as we make our way through Mark chapter 6. So this week, we really have something. We really have 2 separate sections in this 13 verses. We have, first off, Jesus being rejected in his hometown, and then we'll look at the 12 being sent out, which is a pretty major event in the development of Jesus's earthly ministry. So let's look at verses 1 through 6 first. Mark writes, "Then he, Jesus, went out from there and came to his own country, and his disciples followed him. And when the Sabbath had come, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many hearing him were astonished, saying, 'Where did this man get these things? And what wisdom is this which is given to him that such mighty works are performed by his hands? Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?' So they were offended at him. But Jesus said to them, 'A prophet is not without honor except in his own country, among his own relatives, and in his own house.' Now, he could do no mighty work there except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And he marveled because of their unbelief. Then he went out about the villages in a circuit teaching." There's a lot here, and as I was studying this week, I was again struck by the fact that scholars are impressed, maybe that's not quite the right word, but I'll use it, with Mark's really unvarnished portrayal of Jesus. And there's certainly some sense that Matthew and Luke will sometimes backpedal a bit to not quite make it as stark as Mark does sometimes. And so again, I really appreciate Mark for that. So we see this visit to his, as it says, his own country, and really the wording there is his own town. And so Jesus is coming to Nazareth, but this time around, this isn't to see family. This isn't, hey, let's get together on Saturday and have a picnic. That's not what it's about. This is an official visit. This is Jesus the rabbi coming to Nazareth with his disciples. And so they are literally in the pathway of his evangelistic effort at this point. All right. So they're the subject town of Jesus's missionary efforts at this point. And so when it says, and you guys probably know this already, but it says this in verse 2, that the people were astonished with his teaching. And the wording there, the shading there, is that this is not just astonished like, wow, that's a great sunrise, but it's somewhat of resentment, almost to the point of, how dare he be here doing this? And their motivation for that is the fact that they know him. And so it it leads them to ask this question, and there's been some debate about this, and it's kind of lively, I think, that this comes about. And depending on, and if you guys have a different translation that says it a different way, I'd like to hear it. In verse 3, mine says, "Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary?" Anybody got something different there?
NIV just splits it into two questions, but
What does the NIV say, Trent?
isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son and the brother of the whole list?
Okay. Somebody else have something else?
Yeah, mine just says they scoffed.
No,
And
do
then
the first part of verse 3.
started
What do you
saying
have?
he was the carpenter, son of Mary.
Say it again.
They said he scoffed. This is what mine says, and then goes on to say he's a carpenter, son of Mary, brother James, and on and on, you know.
Okay.
But they scoffed. Is how it says.
Yeah, that's a good word. That's a good word. Other?
Are you in Mark?
Look back at,
That's exactly what.
I was thinking there was a translation, but maybe it's just the different gospels. If you look back at Matthew, Matthew 13 and verse 55 says it this way: "Is this not the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary?" Okay. Why is that a big deal? Calling him the son of a carpenter versus, is he not the carpenter, the son of Mary? Any thoughts on that? Got it in the notes, but don't look down. While you're kind of rolling it around in your head, this Greek word for carpenter is the word teknon, and it's a much more general phrase than just carpenter. It's builder. It could even be sculptor, and so it's just kind of a general laboring type of craftsman, if you will, is the idea here. So we tend to think of him as a carpenter, but it might have been some shade off of that as well.
Can also be young person.
Yeah, sure can.
Julius Caesar's last words really was "Kai su teknon" to Brutus, meaning "you too, little kid."
Yeah, that's
which
right.
is actually a pretty insulting phrase, but
indeed.
I don't know. Well, partly, I know with the notes, what you're getting at is by pointing out that he's Mary's son, that kind of deflates his place in a patristic society.
I mean, that's the start of the whole thing, right? I mean, you're the son of a man.
Possibly alluding back to his questionable circumstances of his birth.
Yeah.
May have been rumors flying around. And then just pointing out that he's a carpenter is like just a carpenter.
Yeah. Well, that's a whole other
laws would have kept him in his place.
Right. You know, let's hang on to the carpenter thing for a minute. We'll come back there in just a second, but let's talk about this other. You guys know any other place in the gospel accounts where Jesus's legitimacy is called into question? Maybe a chapter you can think of?
Bunch of them.
Right book, Preston. Yeah. The back end of John chapter 8 is where Jesus says, "Before Abraham was, I am." But before you get there, they get into this whole conversation about our father and your father and all this stuff. And they I can't find it now that I'm looking for it, but basically they say, we know our father. And it's pretty much a slam on Jesus about his legitimacy. And there's I think most New Testament scholars typically believe that there was some scandal whistling about because of Mary's situation that we understand at Jesus's birth. And so it's not beyond the stretch of the imagination to think that when the people were saying this, son of Mary, that there might have been a slight, as you were saying, Trent, there. It's my video keep dying. You guys tracking with that?
Yep.
Other questions on that? Now, I know in our culture today, or in my lifetime, that people's perception of someone who's a child born out of wedlock has changed radically in the last 30, 40 years. It didn't used to be the way it is today. And I'm pretty certain that in first century Galilee, that their attitude toward an adult who had been an illegitimate child in their mind or their perception, that was worse than being a carpenter. So, and I don't know, and I don't get me wrong, I don't know that Jesus was known that way around town, but you just wonder if some of the enemies may have come out from time to time and said it when it made sense.
Are we thinking
That wasn't it?
because we know that now? Did those people know that then? Did they know about his illegitimacy then? Or they didn't know him until he arrived into this town they know him.
This town, they knew him.
But every other town, nobody knew him. So did they know of his birth, ancestry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Or are we interpreting that just because 2,000 years have gone by and now we know that?
Well, there's always the risk we could be doing that, Chris, to be honest with you. We can always take our past, our future knowledge and apply it back, right? I mean, it's always a risk and a danger that we take. I would say that probably it's easiest in his hometown, which was not exactly a sprawling burb.
Right.
You know, I mean, I grew up in a little country town, and it blows me away. I found out stuff years later, right? When I was a kid, I didn't know. Nobody was telling the kids. But as a full-grown adult, you know, I'm talking in my 40s sometimes, and they'd say, "Well, you knew about such and such, right?" I mean, you know, all the little scandals kind of come out. So it's reasonable to think Nazareth, that could have been the case. My point about John 8:58, that actually takes place in Jerusalem. Okay. But let me throw this little pill on you though. Remember, this was during the festival. So, right, it was during the Feast of Tabernacles. And so there were a lot of people in town from Galilee. So it's reasonable to think that there might have been those even there who could have poisoned the water. Did they? I don't know. So the wording in this certainly leads one to think that they were questioning his lineage and background. So, but we may be over driving that passage as well. It's quite possible.
Maybe I have a little more simplistic view. This is a class society. You know, where does this guy come from?
Yep.
He's a carpenter's son. Has he finished his apprenticeship? Where's his master's degree? Does he have a doctrine to be able to speak like this? Who does he think he is?
I think that's very much where we are. But I'm going to throw one more in at you. It was, I was doing some study in Acts this week because that's where I'm reading these days. And I was reading about Paul being a tent maker. And in my reading, they were talking about the fact that even a well-heeled Jewish young man who had, if you will, he was on a different track, is that it was the custom in those days to teach them a hands-on trade. Kind of like, well, you know, if you can't do anything else, you can do this. This will keep you alive. This will keep you fed. And I thought that kind of, because I was in the process of working on this Mark passage too, and I thought, well, you know, if that was their custom, and I know where you're going, and I think that's probably a lot closer to where we are in reality in this passage. But, you know, it doesn't seem to me like, I think sometimes we apply our template of Western America, 21st century over top of this, but it would have been honorable to have a trade in those days. Now, to your point, he wasn't a trained rabbi. He had not studied at the feet of a known rabbi. He did not have the pedigree. And I agree with you. I think that's where the rub comes. And I'm opening the floor for anybody that wants to feed in here as well. But I think,
how do you know that about his not being trained under? Because I had thought, you know, he taught in the synagogue as any male in a synagogue would. You know, because am I wrong?
well, there's so much silence we don't know. And I am speaking from the silence of Scripture, Paula. There's no indication anywhere in the Gospels that he had a mentor, a rabbi like that. And I'm talking about a rabbi from the perspective of following in his path to become a rabbi himself. Okay, I'm not talking about being taught in the synagogue. I'm talking about, you know, taking on the yoke of a rabbi and following his teaching and going that route. And that's where they were so surprised, because he spoke with authority, right? He didn't speak as in, well, Rabbi such and such says this, this, and this. He spoke with authority as if he was the author of the word. And so that's kind of my take on that.
Also wanted to throw out, so if the implication at the time was that he was illegitimate, or if it was a suspicion at the time, for most of human history, you know, among the many things thought about illegitimate children, probably the biggest prohibiting factor is inheriting nobility, and especially inheriting titles of royalty. And at this point in his ministry, he's talking about his kingdom is on the way. His kingdom is, he's coming into his kingdom. So that was probably an immediate all stop on everything.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because the parallel passage, it's not really a parallel passage for this, is over in Luke chapter 4. And it kind of shows up in Luke really early in the gospel, but that he actually talks about that in there. And there's been some question about whether it was then or later that happened. But, you know, certainly as he was developing his ministry, they were hearing more and more of that. They didn't want to hear that. That's what caused a lot of the heartburn as far as the Jewish leaders and how they thought they could trap him with the Romans, right? They couldn't get it any other way. But if he's espousing to be a king, we know how to get rid of him. I think that's where you're heading on that.
I mean, kind of a countervailing, it's nuance, and technically it's used as part of the whole perpetual virginity of Mary, so I'm not going into any of that.
Please.
But there's some idea that maybe Joseph had been much older when he was born, so maybe he's out of the picture by this point, because he kind of disappears out of the rest of the gospel account.
Yeah.
It's possible that he was just much older and even dead by then. And so the only family member they would have known was Mary, and therefore drop Mary's name instead of Joseph just as a matter of familiarity. Nothing,
In which
nothing to
case,
hang any
then,
hats
then you're-
on. Just,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
nothing to hang any hats on. It's just
Right.
possible that they're not making a huge paternity test deal out of it.
It's you know, it's just the fact that the wording changes from gospel to gospel that gets people going, well, why is that? But I think you guys are banging more on the, and Chris started this salvo, is they're banging more on the fact that, you know, how is it you are doing this? We didn't see you get all of this information, and yet here you are as a rabbi doing this, but you just don't have the credentials to do this kind of thing.
Yet in other places, they do call him rabbi.
Indeed, they do. Indeed, they do. Isn't that interesting? Teacher, right? So here's the thing about the people in Nazareth, though. Don't miss it. I put the word here in quotes. The people were scandalized by Jesus. The word offended is in my translation, the last sentence of chapter 3. So they were offended by him. That word is scandalizo. They were scandalized by Jesus positioning himself the way that he did in the synagogue. Okay. It was a scandal. I asked the question, what are the reasons these people are so bothered? I think you guys have already answered that question, so we don't need to linger there.
Well, I've got another side to that though.
All right.
So I was reading not C.S. Lewis, but about C.S. Lewis earlier, and something stuck out that kind of we've all had this feeling, and this is just a great way of putting it into words. So he's talking about people who read literature, but just kind of think about somebody with big ideas, like Jesus walks into the synagogue. So those of us who have been true readers all our life seldom fully realize the enormous extension of our being which we owe to authors. We realize it best when we talk with an unliterary friend. He may be full of goodness and good sense, but he inhabits a tiny world. In it, we should be suffocated. The man who's contented to be only himself and therefore less a self is in prison. This is from Experiment in Criticism. Later he goes on, I see with myriad eyes, but it is still I who see, here as in worship, as in love and moral action, and in knowing I transcend myself and am never more myself than when I do. And what I'm getting at is, this is the most transcendent person that's ever lived. Like, in literally the definition of the word transcendent.
Indeed.
This guy knows a little bit more about reality than anybody else.
Yep.
And sees it from all the angles and knows all the things. And he sees these, you know, if we talk about the passage in Isaiah that Luke mentions in the similar account, you know, or whatever else he would have been talking about in front of these people that sets them off. It's not just that he might be blasphemous, and it's not just that he might be uppity. It's they have no way of getting out of their own little tiny world that they live in and appreciating what they're hearing. You know, we've all thought of that whole small town country bumpkin trope that, you know, don't get uppity, don't get above your raisin, and, you know, here you are talking about all these big words and stuff. But partly this almost here in Mark seems almost a picture of that type of people. And of course, Nazareth really is that type of town. And he and the disciples all got made fun of for being Galileans. So
yeah, when you said that, the thought that struck my mind was, I remember Christine and I were back on the East Coast several years ago and ran into kind of a distant family member, and they said, so we understand you living out in Hawaii now. And I was just like fingernails on a blackboard, right? But I mean, we probably were the most exotic people they'd ever met, right? Because we had been more than 50 miles from that little town. And that's exactly when you started describing that. That's the thought I had. And you're right. I mean, there's that idea, they would never think to leave, but they despise anybody else who would.
Except to go to Jerusalem, but
Right. And then you beat feet right back because Jerusalem's a terrible place to go. Right. Yeah. That's what they're thinking. I'm not saying that. But,
right.
Yeah, but yeah.
But to add to Trent's point is they're going to Jerusalem out of duty,
Right.
but not out of the discussion that Jesus has with the woman at the well in Samaria, because that's kind of what's missing from this whole beginning verse presentation. What's missing is what makes it look like this very transcendent individual is talking to bumpkins who can't relate. But if they possessed the reason for their sojourn to Jerusalem, that would have created a bridge that would have made Jesus less amazed. That's going to follow.
Yeah, but even the woman at the well, she was asking questions. She was engaged. Is that your point? She was engaged, and they weren't. They were offended.
And she was engaged to the point where the clicking happened. She was engaged to the point where the light bulb went off, and she didn't need the practicality to help make a connection with Jesus. The bridge got built because of what is missing in this passage that we're going to get to in a couple of moments.
Sure. Well, I don't know why my video keeps stopping. I'll kind of stop it and start it, and we'll get it going. In a very real sense, I mean, people leave home and they come back, and they want you to stay right where you were. And how dare you go and learn anything and develop and come back? There are the practical issues of that as well, and that's why I think it's so poignant what Jesus says in verse 4. I remember I used this on a guy years ago. He was talking about how he had gone off to school and gotten a good job and was respected in his career and he was a business consultant, and he had come back. I think the story went that he had come back to his hometown and was consulting for a business in that town, but of course he was still a little rusty. And I remember I looked across at him. I said, well, a prophet's not without honor except his own nation. And he kind of looked at me like, because this was a business meeting, and he stopped and looked at me, and then he's like, yeah, you're right. So, the fact is that Jesus, don't be offended, guys. Jesus' statement was not original at this point. This was a truism that was floating around the Middle East and the Roman world at that time, and it could be applied to different things. So Jesus was just taking a known truism and applying it to his very real situation at this point, that you could replace it. And as a matter of fact, somebody made the observation that a parallel saying here could be familiarity breeds contempt. Right? I mean, that's the essence beneath what Jesus is saying here. It's like, well, they just think they know me too much to be able to hear what I've got to say, is kind of the bottom line. But he said it in a much more Christ-like way than I just did. So there you are. This is the point that I think is so powerful, though, is that he says he could do no mighty work there. Mark is very frank about the words about the works that Jesus does or doesn't do in Nazareth. And it's interesting that where it says in verse 6 that he marveled. This is the only time in Mark's gospel that we see Jesus marveling at anything. Now, was he surprised? No, but it still doesn't mean that he didn't have to stand back and kind of shake his head and say, man. I put in your notes to note Matthew 8, 5 through 13 and Luke 7, 1 through 10. This is the opposite marveling. This is with the centurion where Jesus, he says, well, I tell somebody to do this or do that. They just do it. And it says Jesus marveled at his faith. It was the opposite of that. And really, In all the gospel accounts, all four, these are the only three verses that I found where Jesus marveled at something. And two of them were positive, one of them was negative. And that was the lack of faith that the people had in Nazareth. Which leads to the question, because I think we need to drill down on this a little bit. Because it says Jesus could do no mighty work there, and that gets the enemies of the gospel going, see, I told you. What keeps Jesus from doing more in Nazareth?
So, Pastor, that's the question I've got. I mean, it seems like this cooled his jets. I don't know if it, hurt his feelings or subdued his power or what happened here. But, in readings later on, he gets back on his horse again. But it's like he's knocked off his horse a little bit here. And maybe that just shows that he's actually a human.
All right, I'm going to let you. I'm going to let that kind of whistle in the air and see what other people might have to say. Agree or disagree with Kurt?
Or his humility says, why argue with a fool? Just move on with the world.
Don't cast your pearls before swine. Let me read you a sentence. Let me read you guys a sentence. This is out of James Brooks's Mark commentary, page 100. He says, God and his Son could do anything, but they have chosen to limit themselves in accordance to human response. You guys want to give me any big concepts on that one?
Sounds like exactly what's happening here.
This is a fun kind of discussion that sometimes we'll go off the rails with, and Trent will lead us there, which is this is basically Jesus setting the rules. This is the when you land on Park Place, you get $200 instead of just when you pass go. It's not that Jesus can't do, it's that Jesus confines the doing based on what the precept that's been set up is, and that is this concept of faith.
Yeah, I mean, that's been my usual response is, there's so much focus on it's your faith that's healed you, or your faith has made you well, or your faith has done this or that. And, the messianic secret is usually opposed to instances of people whose faith was involved in their miraculous encounter with him. I'd also point out that if the reading out of whatever teaching he gave didn't clear out the entire building, then the yelling at them about a prophet is without honor in their own country probably cleared the rest of the room. He might have just run out of customers.
That's a funny thought. Okay, I know you did that for effect. There's been a lot of debate, and there were times that Jesus healed somebody and they didn't demonstrate faith. We just looked at the Gadarene demoniac, right? I mean, we just saw that, and it seems like Jesus did that without any real movement, overture on his part. But more often than not, he wanted to see something from them. And you got to think about it this way. He could have gone through Nazareth and said, you're healed, you're healed, you're healed, you're healed. There you go. He could have done that. And he could have. Kurt, I think it's kind of interesting the way you said that, he kind of had his feelings hurt. I don't think he was surprised by it, but indeed he may have still, it's kind of pained him a bit that his people You know, he certainly seemed to have that attitude when he got to Jerusalem, or late on in his ministry. You know, he talked about, you know, the mother hen and all that. But one writer had made the statement, and I think it's a good one, is that if he started healing people who had hardened hearts, they'd still have hardened hearts. There would be no change in them. I mean, the whole point of healing them was not just to heal them. The healing was to give him an entree into their lives. And if there was no move toward him, then, and these are my words, he's basically just rewarding them for what? They don't believe him, they despise him, but, well, great, he healed me. Thanks. I mean, it's kind of like petulant children, isn't it? You know, kids lots of times, you know, just expect you to heap stuff on them. I mean, it's like the two boys in A Christmas Story. You know, they're cool with the toys and stuff, but they get the shirts and the clothes and they're like, yeah, and then that's out the back, right? I mean, we've all seen kids do that. It's like, you know, we work pretty hard for those too, dude. And so Jesus wasn't operating in a quid pro quo perspective. Don't get me wrong about that. But he was looking for people to move toward him in some form or fashion. I think you guys would agree with that. I mean, this wasn't just an exercise to heal Israel. And it was, so when there was no faith shown, he wasn't going to stick around, because in essence, he'd be rewarding their hard-heartedness. And they would still have the same hatred or distrust or lack of appreciation for him when he left. And so there would be no entree for the gospel message. He could have. And I say big ideas. I mean, it's the difference between the sovereignty of God and the free will of man, right? I mean, God can always operate. God can always operate. God is all powerful. Nothing is impossible with God. God can do anything he wants to do. But again, he often chooses to operate based on the receptivity of humanity. You don't want to be saved? Don't be saved. Say what, Trent?
He's also already come 99% of the way at this point. If he's standing in front of you,
here I am.
Seriously, what more do you want?
Yeah, he's done the whole kenosis thing at this point, right? I mean, he's standing on earth in front of you. Good point.
You sit here demanding all these things, and you're like, what do you mean? I'm already here.
Yeah.
I've already done this much.
Well said.
Want lunch, Trent, and we're going to see that coming up soon.
Not only do they want lunch the next day too.
Wait a man's heart is through his stomach.
I'm not sticking around. Wow.
In verse 4, when Jesus used that, I think you called it a truism.
Yes, ma'am.
And refer to himself as a prophet, is that what he thought that they should think he is?
What do you think?
At this point, yeah. And that's probably why he was rejected.
Because he was a prophet?
Well, because they were, yes. Well, because that's what they thought he was by what he was doing.
Well, they didn't have a very good history with prophets, did they?
No. They like to stone him.
Well, he calls them out later about that. You know, the fact that, you know, they want to elicit the names of the prophets. He said, but you're the ones that killed them. You know, your families, the graves are here. You know, you talk all great about them, but your family's the ones that killed them. And so, yeah, well, I mean, he's obviously operating as a prophet, very much so. prophet, priest, and king. So, by the time you get to the Olivet Discourse, he's pretty much totally prophesying at that point. But then, we always have to remember that a prophet not only is a foreteller, but a forthteller as well. Thus saith the Lord. And so the office of prophet is as much about proclaiming the truth of the gospel and applying it to the lives of the people and their circumstances it is about talking about future events. So yeah, very much Jesus is doing that, for sure.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Change the word prophet to some other descriptor.
Yeah, that's where the truism comes in. Mm-hmm.
Expert. I'm an expert. An expert is questioned in a group of experts.
Mm-hmm.
A doctor is questioned in a group of doctors.
Yep.
They're questioning a group of farmers too, but
Right.
But the problem with wielding that potential equation is the Israelites haven't had a real prophet other than John the Baptist in quite some time, and John the Baptist was a different kind of prophet than what their history had them used to.
Say that last sentence again. I'm sorry.
Yeah, John the Baptist was a different kind of prophet than what their history had them used to. Their prophets weren't out baptizing and telling them that the kingdom of God was at hand. Their prophets were telling them somebody outside of the Romans are going to come and take you captive. If you don't honor the land, if you practice idolatry, then you'll be taken away from the land. So John the Baptist was different, and then Jesus was vastly different, and they really didn't know quite how to take either one of the two of those folks.
I was kind of thinking through, just kind of doing a quick inventory in my head of the Old Testament prophets. I mean, certainly some of them were more about object lessons, right? There was more object lessons, and we'd see that with them. Some were more designated to go into the halls of power to proclaim for God. But yeah, the baptism for repentance was definitely something different than they'd ever seen before. And then you don't see Jesus as kind of being kind of classic prophet material with all of his parables and things. Well, obviously he's working a lot of miracles. That was not something that they were seeing.
Correct. And the variety.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if anything, he's in the vein of perhaps Elijah and Elisha, who have not been present for several hundreds of years.
Yeah. I would agree with that. Because they certainly were bringing some pretty powerful signs and wonders with them to the table.
Granted, you see more in Matthew and John, then slightly less so in Luke, and then less again in Mark, that Jesus puts himself squarely in the continuity of Jewish prophets, as partly as bookending prophecy and saying this was for a time and place, but it's also about what was future to them and is starting to come true now. Here I am. But also he would regularly use those prophets' words as his own words to say, look, this is the vocabulary of our faith. You saw what happened when these guys wrote it. You're the people that kept it. You thought it was important enough to keep reading it and memorizing it and telling it to each other. And now I'm telling it to you, but here's what it means.
Yeah.
So they knew the words, not necessarily the person's, the type of person who would say the words. Some of the prophets portray themselves as humble farmers and gardeners, but they're probably actually reasonably wealthy guys that were kind of like country gentlemen tending their little, flower garden,
2,000
vegetable garden, because clearly it takes a certain level of people in the ancient world to be literate enough to write something that people would preserve.
Right.
So it's not common that an ancient world prophet would have showed up out of the riffraff.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's good that you're talking about, certainly Matthew, we see it very much, right? Because of the Jewish tradition that's there, and just, as you say, Luke's got a good smattering of it as well. And very much putting himself in that line of prophets. And so again, I think Jesus could look back at the Old Testament prophets and say that verse 4 spoke about them too, because they could get some love elsewhere, but not among their own people. They didn't like the message. Preston, you were talking about it. I mean, they're saying, either repent or you're going to be drug off by another nation. They weren't too happy about that. When they're getting told, God despises your sacrifice. That didn't sit too well. It's like show compassion to the poor and the children and the widows, and they're going, wait a minute, what's all this about? It just was. They didn't like being told they were the stench in God's nose. This didn't work for them too well.
Or when Isaiah told them that their Messiah was going to be wounded for our transgressions and bruised for our iniquities.
Yeah. And a light to the Gentiles? Woo! Yeah. Plenty there to get them upset. So, I mean, you see it, guys. You guys are talking. Paula, you started the conversation with the whole thing about the prophet, but they'd never liked this kind of talk. They really hadn't. And so Jesus wasn't surprised at all. Just got to hope maybe his hometown. I mean, I don't know. I'm really injecting me into Jesus, and I shouldn't do that. But I mean, you'd like to think that your own hometown, would do better than everybody else, and then they failed to. So there you go. But with that, we come to verse 7. Well, really, in some translations, maybe some of the ones you guys have, kind of put the last half of 6 with the next section where it says, and he went about the villages in a circuit teaching. And so some put that with the next section. And there's a sense that this episode in Nazareth somewhat pushed him out. I don't see that. I mean, he had the plan. He always had the plan. And so you just have to realize that even conservative scholars sometimes seem to want to invest more humanity in Jesus, maybe than, and I don't mean that in a heretical way. I mean, I know he's fully God and fully man, don't get me wrong, but they want to make him more frail or more human than he really was, right? I mean, he's led by the Holy Spirit. He is God, and he's not the same bumbler and stumbler that we are. And at the end of the day, he's just not. And so, but I see them so often. It's the same way that I see scholars far too often not giving the Holy Spirit the right credence as far as being the author of the Word of God, right? It's like, well, Paul must have been thinking such and such. It's like, well, maybe Paul was, but don't forget who was directing Paul. This is another comment for another day. But let's look at this second section about the 12. It says in verse 7, and he called the 12 to himself, and he began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them power over unclean spirits. He commanded them to take nothing for the journey except a staff, no bag, no bread, no copper in their money belts, but to wear sandals and not to put on 2 tunics. And he said to them, whatever place you enter a house, stay there till you depart from that place. And whoever will not receive you nor hear you, when you depart from there, shake off the dust under your feet as a testimony against them. Assuredly, I say to you, it will be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city. So they went out and preached that people should repent. And they cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick, and healed them. Okay. This is going to kind of sandwich in. We'll see kind of the back end of this next week or 2 weeks from now. We'll see the kind of back end when they show back up after this. This is really the next logical step, right? He had told them early on, "You'd be fishers of men." He'd called them. He'd started to teach and develop them, and now there's time to send them out. Standard discipleship process. I've shown you, and now you're going to go out. And there's that other, I don't know, you guys have probably heard it, I do it, you watch me, and then you do it, and I watch you, and then you do it. And so they've gone through that process, and now they're out on the field doing what the Lord has called them to do. Most writers seem to think that this really was an official commissioning, and they kind of ride that on the fact that when it says he began to send them out, that word is where we get our word. That's a verb version of our word apostle, sent out ones. And so that this is a commissioning that he says, now go. I could have answered this, but I said I'd let you guys answer. Why did he send them out 2 by 2? What was the reasoning for that, do you think?
They had to get back to the ark.
What?
They had to get back to the ark.
All right. John, you got something better than that.
I'm sure it was a point of encouraging each other.
Okay. All right. You ever been out knocking on doors with somebody? It's an encouragement to be with somebody, believe me. All right, I think that's part of it.
In the military, we have a process called two-person integrity. Whenever you're going out with something really important, you send someone else with you to make sure they don't do something shady on their own.
Mm. Need for witness.
Two-person integrity.
Need for witness.
Say
Pictures.
that again,
Need for witnesses. It comes from the old law. Pictures or it didn't happen.
I think safety and security.
Okay. I think that's true too. I think that what John and Christine shared, those are all very practical, and I think they certainly work out. We know there's a lot of robbers and different things on the road, and want to make sure that you stay right. Accountability, right? Accountability, encouragement. You're not out there on your own. Chris, I think that what you said though is the very center of why he did it, because by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter is decided, right? You had to have 2 witnesses. You couldn't accuse somebody in a court of a crime and just be 1 witness. You had to have 2. Always had to have 2. And remember what these guys are doing here, right? They're testifying to Jesus, to the Messiah, right? And so if you're out there, and by the way, in one of the parallels, I think it's Matthew, let me check. He says in verse 5 of Matthew 10, he says, do not go into the city, and I'm sorry, let me read it again. Do not go into the way of the Gentiles, and do not enter a city of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And so Jewish sensibilities would have been, I need to hear it from 2 people. I need to hear it from 2 people to believe that it's absolutely true. So, Chris, I believe that at the end of the day, for all the other very practical reasons that you guys shared, and I think they're all very solid and were part of that. But the ultimate reason that he sent 2 was because he needed 2 witnesses in front of everybody. That goes all the way to the book of Revelation, doesn't it? Other thoughts? All right, now I'm going to pitch a grenade in the middle of it. Oh, they found me. Oh, it's in my pocket. Sorry, excuse me, my phone's ringing. Is this any of you guys? Okay.
Two people also help in the recovery factor.
Explain, please.
Sure. Going out 2 by 2, although you may be positively propping each other up, doesn't mean you're going to be received well.
Mhm.
And so sometimes when you're received negatively, it's easier to bounce back when there's the two of you versus the one of you being rejected.
Yeah, that's certainly true. I know there's some days where I got to get kicked in the teeth, and it'd be really nice to have somebody here to commiserate with for a few minutes before I get back on the horse again. You know, you saying that makes me think there's something else. You know, there's wisdom in a multitude of counselors. We know that. And so, you know, you wonder if there may have been times where, you know, one looked at the other and said, all right, what do you think, man? Is this the house we stay with? Do we go? Right. And so there is that opportunity to bounce that off of each other as well. I call that the side chair effect. I don't know if you guys, was I talking to you about that, Trent? I was talking to somebody about the side chair effect, where Christine and I, when we first worked together before we got married, the office we worked in, somebody would always, you had a side chair next to your desk, and whenever you were trying to work through a problem, because we were computer programmers, you'd go sit in their side chair and kind of bounce the ideas off of them. Sometimes you figured it out for yourself, but sometimes they were helpful. So I call that the side chair effect. We counsel with each other to come to a conclusion. So I like that though, Preston. Yeah, that kind of goes back to that encouragement John was talking about, you know, just that was a particularly tough day, right? Or I don't know about you guys, don't you like to share your joyful stuff too? I mean, high-fiving each other and it's like, man, that was great. I do. When I have a good day, I can't wait for Christine to get home so I can tell her how great I was.
Well, these guys are also not of a uniform age and occupation. So I'm sure there's a whole lot of master and apprentice interrelationships among the group. You know, John is a teenager at this point.
Yeah.
I'm really not going to set him loose in the countryside, you know, as an example. But he already knows Peter, or he might hang out with his brother.
Right.
Or, you know, whatever other combinations you'd want to put out there. You know, Thomas gets labeled doubting Thomas, but he's really been eager Thomas all along until he's completely shot at the end of his, you know, after the crucifixion. So he's probably like that real go-getter, ride or die kind of guy. You need that to maybe prop up somebody like Judas, who's maybe sort of in it for the money. Or Luke, who's a little overly practical and, you know, kind of needs to have everything written down very exactly.
Luke's not in there. Luke's not in there.
That's right. Yeah, sorry. But like throw in like the tax collector or something.
There you go. Well, that's what I was thinking about, right? I mean, you might need to dilute a tax collector out there. It might be nice if somebody says, "Oh, aren't you the guy?" Yeah, he's good. I'll vouch for him.
Right. That's what I was thinking of.
I'm cracking up about you. You couldn't let John run around loose out in the countryside. It's just an image that I gotta kind of grapple with a little bit there. Because yeah, he's like 17 years old or something, right? It's like, come on, man. Stop talking to her. We got job to do. Could be a whole lot of that kind of stuff, guys.
Yeah, sorry, I gotta contest that, and I appreciate us punching John a little bit, but John's one of the leaders, so John is probably paired with maybe a Thomas, the way that you're saying, or maybe a Matthew, and unfortunately, I believe that John's kind of the lead guy there, even though he's 17, 18, 19, because Jesus is grooming those three guys as sub-leaders, John, Peter, and James. So those guys are getting trained as sub-leaders for the rest of the 12.
Yeah.
So John may be a youngster, but he's a powerful youngster.
Yeah, I didn't mean he was incapable or unenergetic, just as like we were saying earlier with some of the practicalities.
Well, and 17-year-olds back then aren't like 17-year-olds today, or even when I was 17. That's for sure. But I'd still like to think that every so often he'd be a teenager. Come on now. So just had to kind of. I mean, I've known honor students and all those kind of things in my life too. But sometimes they just get a little crazy. So, but we can ask him about it one day. We'll see how that goes. So
I'm banking on if you're looking for crazy, Simon the Zealot is a little bit of a crazy guy.
yeah. All right, we'll go with that.
Actual cloak and dagger.
Actual cloak and dagger. That's right. And so there's been some conflict, just a little bit of paint rubbing going on when we talk about the instructions as far as the synoptics are concerned. If you guys want any more amplification on this, I will give you a place to go look. But and maybe it's just stretching a little bit much, but you see where Jesus says, take nothing except these things, but then you in verses 8 and 9, but then over I believe it's in Matthew where he says, don't take a staff, but where here it says take a staff, and my people are going, I knew there was a conflict. But there are those who've written about this, and among them is Gleason Archer. You guys know Gleason Archer? He wrote this really cool book, and this is an old version of it, but it's called the Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties, and it's pretty cool because he takes different conflicting passages and smooths them out and says, here's probably what this really means. And he gets on board with where others are and makes the statement and the observation that in Mark, the verbs talk about taking things, whereas in Matthew, the verbs can mean to acquire things. And so his explanation is probably the most complete, but it's the idea that there's a harmony there. If you look at it from the standpoint of Jesus is saying you can take a staff, but you can't pick up another one. And so that's kind of the idea there. So if you look back at Matthew, you look at Mark, you look at Luke, and you see some variety there and maybe even some conflict, it could be in the underlying language. And I think the larger lesson there is that we are operating in a language that's not the original language. And I think that's where a lot of people run into problems when they start to talk about conflicts and things in the Bible. It's like, well, to really get the clarity, you sometimes have to go back to the original language to see what it's talking about. And so it's, again, the general principle when it comes to Bible interpretation or your own vision of the Bible is give the Bible the benefit of the doubt. Go do your work. And so that kind of shoots in the foot, the fact that maybe the only thing you ever need to study the Bible is just the Bible. It helps to have some other helps along the way as well. And so, not that you can't learn everything you can think of through the Word of God, but sometimes it just helps to know below the surface of the English Bible. So, just wanted to say that out loud. If you're interested in Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties, that is definitely available still for sale. And page 326 in my version is where it talks about that. He actually has a long section about comparing Mark 6 with Matthew 10. I thought that was cool. I always do that whenever I kind of go, I check out Gleason Archer because he's pretty good. He's a pretty good compendium of that sort of thing. Here's what's under all of it, though. Don't take this, don't take that, don't take this, don't take that, don't take the other thing. Bottom line is depend on God. Depend on God. That's what your reliance should be on. Not about, getting like I do when I travel. Christine is actually the lighter traveler than I am. She will have a smaller bag than me. I do not seem to be able to pack lightly. I am terrified about my trip in the fall to Europe because I don't think I can carry enough. And she has severely saddled me with a size restriction. So I'm going to stink for days, I think. So, but There's this dependence. Sorry, too much information. I'm sorry.
They have indoor plumbing in Europe.
You said they've got washers and dryers, well,
Yeah.
washers.
You're just blowing it for me now.
So amazing fashion designers are there too. So go there with what you can and go with one and come back with three.
Chris, I like the cut of your jib, brother. I'm digging that. I'm really digging that. I want me some pointy Italian shoes, man. That's what I want. So I will be so out of place in Hawaii. Golly day. But so when I read this, that basically it was you had the coat on your back, you had your stick, you had your I was gonna say slippers, you had your sandals, and that's it, and that's where you go. And oh, by the way, when you get there, you're going to be living on the good graces of the people in that town, and so there really is this dependence on God for all that they were going to do. They were going to walk the walk, in essence, is what they were going to do. And what's interesting is he says to them, he says, in whatever place you enter, stay there. And so if you walked in, to whatever, I can't think of any Jewish names, but you walked into this, guy's house and they gave you hospitality, and maybe they had a decent room and she was a decent cook. And then you found out that a guy 3 houses down had a much nicer house and she was a much better cook. You weren't going to be doing that. And you think about that, there's a practicality to that, right? You don't want to insult people by moving from one place to another, looking for the next bump up. Where the Lord provided, that's where you stayed. And that was the idea. And you honored the home that the Lord had provided for you. I think there's a lesson there for us in 21st century America that, what the Lord provides may not be the Ritz. But if it's set, why are you shaking your head, Preston?
There's a difference between the youth hostel and the intercontinentals in Europe. And I get what Jesus's precepts are, but I got to push back on that bad boy.
That's why you're not one of the 12.
You're not intended to stay in the youth hostel. You're supposed to be moving on to the next destination.
Oh, Chris, I like it better when you're quieter.
He's got a point there, right? I mean, if it stinks, right? I mean, if it stinks, well, Lord, I want to be there a short time and then I move on. I'm going to have to do a sermon series on this little section because there's a lot of teaching points in this if you really want to think about it. And I'm sorry, I'm going to use a kind of an overused phrase, but our sufficiency in Christ, right? I mean that's, and trusting him for all that we have. I mean, there's a real sense of that. And I know that sufficiency in Christ maybe means a little something different or more than that, but
There's an opportunity for either a lesson or indictment for the people in those villages too.
come on,
to do
talk
with,
about it.
Greeks called it xenia, and I know I've mentioned that word before.
Yep.
But the whole culture of hospitality, at one point, Jesus has to go out of his way and tell people, when you came and visited in prison, when you fed me when I was hungry, when you clothed me when I was sick, all those things. If you do these to the least of me, then you did it also for me. But if you didn't do any of those things, et cetera, et cetera. So he's sending his special group out with literally the clothes on their back and expecting them, yes, they're relying on God's provision, but he's also demonstrating the faithfulness or lack of faithfulness to the cultural but also divine principle of hospitality, holiness, accepting of being accepting of strangers, which goes, you can see it all the way back with Lot in Sodom, the two that turned out to be angels come in, and he's the only one in town that knows how to treat them properly. Everybody else wants to do the things that they want to do.
Gently said.
So it's, I think that's a consistent drumbeat, throughout. That's clearly a divine expectation of our behavior towards each other. I mean, God certainly is hospitable towards us in all of our failed, miserable nature. How simple is it for us to be a little bit hospitable to each other, even as strangers?
Well, you bring up a really good point about the, the one that you did the least of these, you did for me, and it really was the object lesson. And I think that's where the look toward judgment comes in verse 11 about Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, that you're right. I mean, it exactly points to that there would be judgment for that. By the way, some manuscripts don't have that section, that sentence in Mark chapter 6, verse 11. It perhaps is there, but it may be a gloss because it is in Matthew and the parallel passage. And just so you guys know, sometimes what would happen is the scribes, as they would go through this, if they saw something lacking from one of the parallels, they just kind of gloss it over to the other. So, exactly where that falls, we don't know. But Matthew certainly records it. There's no question about Jesus saying that exactly the same circumstance, for what it's worth. I want to read you what James Brooks says about verse 11 about wiping the dust off your feet. And I've never seen anybody do this legitimately, but I've talked to Christians who used to go out door knocking, and having gone with people who would do this at the end of people's sidewalks if they would not receive them on the front porch to have them talk about Jesus. I don't. There's a lot of conversation about the fact that Jesus's instructions here were for this particular period, and they may not be transferable to us necessarily. And so we always got to be a little bit careful about being too literal about that, and perhaps in our culture doing it may be a little more offensive. But here's what Brooks says about it. He says, Jews returning to the Holy Land removed foreign dust from their shoes and clothing in order not to defile the land. So imagine that they're coming into Israel, and they stop at the border and they get the dust off, so they're not bringing that defilement into Israel. He said what Jesus prescribed was a symbolic action in the tradition of the ancient prophets to indicate first a warning and then a judgment if rejection of the message and messengers persisted. The action may also symbolize that a town which rejected the message of the disciples, listen, was not a part of the true Israel. Whether that's exactly what Jesus was banking on or not. But again, like we talked about the truism earlier, this was something, and I think it's so cool that we see that Jesus would, as we see often Paul doing with words in the New Testament, Jesus would repurpose different customs and traditions for the early church. And so it wasn't something that was absolutely foreign to these men, but he was using it in a different way, in a fresh way that they would understand and be able to apply to the work that they had to do. So I might have already cheated the answer on this, but I asked the question here in regards to not just the red letters part where he talks to them about staying or not, or the dust, but also the higher section about what to take and not to take. How does Jesus's instructions relate to our modern evangelistic efforts, do you think? What parts of everything we've talked about today still work for us and we can apply?
Well, I mean, you can see in here that this is meant to just be, you could go out for the day and make a day trip of it. It doesn't have to be a production. It doesn't have to be something specially prepared for. Walk like you were going down to get some vegetables at the farmer's market, in their case. You have just enough to get down the street and back again. And whoever you meet along the way, that's who you meet, and that's who you talk to.
Okay. I like that.
So, Pastor, I kind of see it as like a faith thing. Lord sent his men out with not much, and they needed to have faith that everything they would need would be supplied. And so, we should do the same thing. Have faith that we give it to God, and whatever's needed will be supplied for us to get the job done he needs us to do. That's what I'm getting.
Okay. I would say that's definitely there. Absolutely. Any other thoughts in our modern evangelistic efforts?
Also, and bring in the sower with the seeds.
Can you apply that to every passage in this Bible?
Just about.
Okay. I'm
But-
hoping you were going to tell me that, yes.
The whole idea that you're just throwing seeds and they're going to land where they land. And it's not exactly your business what happens, at least on this, I think, on the evangelistic end of the task. More importantly, don't take it personally.
Yeah.
Don't build up some expectation of exactly how it's going to go and then be surprised when it doesn't. You just do the sowing and then see what happens.
What you just said about
that
don't
here.
take it personally. I've heard that said so many times, and it's easy to say. It's another thing to actually live it, right? When somebody says, "Well, they're not rejecting you; they're rejecting Jesus," and that's right. That's 100% right. But we in our human flesh say, "But I'm the one that's given the message, and I'm the one who's got the face slammed the door in front of." Right? I mean, so it's like, well, it felt pretty much like they did reject me. But you're exactly right. I mean, they've just chosen not to accept the offer. Maybe that's why you need that second guy there with you to say, "Come on, man, let's go next door."
I mean,
So I like Trent's last part. I'm on board with Trent's last part. Is don't take it personally. Don't let it fester. But I think societally and culturally, the rules have changed quite a bit.
In that we are offended by everything now?
Well, in that the Jehovah Witnesses and the Latter-day Saints do this literally today. And I don't know that they're successful in their doing, but they believe that there's a blessing in doing it the way that they do. And here's what I mean by that. I think what Jesus implies here that I think we need to take along with Trent's summation is we need to be intentional. We need to be purposeful about the going. But I don't know that it is necessarily culturally okay to go 2 by 2 any longer, because sometimes in today's culture, in our America, maybe this works off of our continent, off of our maybe even off of our hemisphere. 2 people coming today may seem aggressive, right? Additionally, we can't have the anticipation that we're going to be able to stay or even be invited in to the person's home. And a witness, Chris is right on when he talks about the witness for the Jewish culture, but we don't care and value the 2-person confirmation as a witness statement any longer. So those 3 components may be those that we don't need any longer to be effective in our purposeful going and seed spreading.
Since you brought that up, I mean, if you go back and you read about the history of Jerry Falwell starting Thomas Road Baptist Church, that guy single-handedly went out in a year and built that church to over 700 members. In the 1950s, in the 56, 55, 56, 57, somewhere in that area. You couldn't do that today. There's no housewife that's going to let you come up on her front porch as a single man and talk to her today. You couldn't do it. And you wouldn't want to do it because the next thing you know, you're getting run into jail for being accused of something. And you can't do that. And so the last time I went knocking door to door, and some of you guys know my friend Gene Thomason. I mean, Gene and I went knocking on doors years ago, and he didn't have a. There was nothing. It just, do you know where you're going to spend an eternity? Do you know where you're going to spend your eternity? And they'd say, and then he'd say, why? I mean, it was straight up. I stood back a step or two. It was just kind of pretty crazy, but it would be very hard to do that in the 21st century. I would tell you, it's easier to do it in Hawaii than almost anywhere, because people will let you come up on their lanai. You're not coming inside ever, but they'll talk you to death on the front lanai. And I've had some great conversations with the Jehovah's Witness out in my front lawn. I mean, me and Ricky, the Jehovah's Witness guy, he comes by. I think I'm his practice guy, but yeah, it would be very difficult to do that today. But Preston, to your point, I think we see at the end of Jesus's end of the Gospels, he's saying, "As you go, make disciples." And so it was the training in chapter 6, to say, "Here's how you do it." But by the end, he's saying, this should just be organic in your life. As you go, make disciples. And that's the promise for us today, I think. So, because really, if all we ever do is go out on the old traditional Tuesday night soul winning, if that's all a church does, I can tell you this: a church of 100 members will probably have 6 to 8, maybe 10 people show up on a Tuesday night for an hour to go knock on doors. If that's their entire evangelistic effort during the week, that's pretty puny. Just saying.
I'll tell you, you just got to pick who your number 2 is more carefully. A baby makes a great wingman.
It's a puppy.
/ accessory. Yeah.
I was gonna say, going forward, like we're always a pair. Like, we have the Holy Spirit with us at all times.
Oh,
like we already have our number 2.
And he's a pretty good witness, isn't he?
John coming off the top rope.
Yeah. I kind of listened to those 2 comments, like, which one am I going to grab? All right. Other thoughts on that? That kind of went everywhere.
Yeah, and I like that you compounded that with the Great Commission, is that we need to be purposeful, but going out soul winning 2 by 2 may not be the most effective way to do that, because that's not as you go. That's actually very premeditated, in the sense that it's not a natural occurrence. It's you're targeting a neighborhood, or you're targeting this community, when you're almost ignoring the place you shop, the place you get your hair cut, the gym you go to. And that's all of the purposeful, intentional as you go that we often neglect when we practice literally from the scripture, going out this way.
By the way, I just want to be honest with you guys. I have no problem going out door to door. I got no issue with that. Usually when I do that these days, I haven't done it lately, just because the hills are too hard. But normally when I'm going out knocking on doors, it's because we're inviting people to a church event, we're inviting people to something like that, or to inform them about something. Is typically more the way that I do it. And my kind of, as you're going, is you knock on their door and you say, "Hey, we're having a movie night, or we're having a book bag give out, or whatever, we're having sunrise service, or whatever like that." And as you're going is say, "Oh, well, I used to go to church, but I don't really go anymore." And as you're going, now you're in the conversation, right? And so I take nothing away. I mean, if there's churches that are still putting guys on the street out there knocking on doors, God bless them. But yeah, it's got to be more than that, Preston, to your point. It's really got to be more than that, just that.
Oh, another part that's not just the soul winning side of this whole thing. I mentioned it to you the other day, or like I've brought up the whole peripatetic school thing about Plato walking around with Aristotle and teaching them everything.
Yeah.
Sometimes this isn't about all the lost people out there, although That's part of it. Sometimes it's about, hey, I'm used to doing this thing and you're not. Let's walk you through your growth as a believer. We're out 2 by 2 because you need some confidence, you need some exposure, and you need some whatever. And it whittles me a little bit to say, hey, I'm the one like trying to bring somebody along and I'm going to pick something up off of that.
Now you're talking about a lost art, Trent. You're talking about real discipling and real accountability and having folks not just attend a religion or a building, but actually be accountable to show progress and growth and a manifestation of the faith that they claim that they have. And you just got yourself into a whole lot of trouble because that's not what church people want to do today.
Yeah. Well, especially consider there's 2 ways to go about it. You know, women interact face to face, men interact shoulder to shoulder. So which one do you want to do here? Do you want to go talk to a bunch of people? Well, I know who your pair needs to be. Do you just need to go out and be out and be, have build some confidence and visibility? I know who your pair needs to be.
There you go.
You need a good 1-2? Well, then maybe you mix it up.
Not just batting at the air, huh? Okay, I'm with it. Well, it is getting to be a lost art. I think I've got to be honest with you, just from my own experience recently, with a number of people, is I think that there's starting to become a hunger and a thirst more for that kind of mentorship. I think just the years of famine in that area, especially in Trent and John's generation, and around that age group, I think there's more of a hunger and thirst for that. Maybe I'm wrong, and I'll reserve total judgment on it, but it seems like that is gaining a toehold again, or maybe for the first time in my life. I don't know.
Well, they say when the student's ready, the master will appear, but
Indeed,
you need some volunteers.
Yeah, well, that too. Amen. To that end, we're seeing some new folks show up at the church, and they're starting to stick. So on Sunday mornings, and that's a good thing. But of course, then that next step comes in, and okay, now let's see what we can do with that. And so, I asked the question about what dynamics are at work with shaking the dust off their feet. I think we already kind of got there with our conversation. So we kind of answered our questions as we went tonight. Maybe that'll inform my writing format in the days to come, or maybe read my notes a couple more times ahead of time so I make sure I don't blow the questions. But that'll finish us up for tonight. Again, next week, we're going to be in a pretty tough section of Mark. We're going to be looking here at John the Baptist's death, and so I think that can definitely bring in some different dynamics, a little history, whatever. So you historians can start ramping up now for that, and kind of reach back and forth a bit and see what all that's about. So we'll be in verses 14 through 29 of Mark chapter 6 next week.